Yeah, we can. And I think architects have a bigger role to play than they have played, because architects
Mm.
are trained to create spatial imaginations. And that spatial imagination, let me say, just a picture of something. An image is very compelling for people to work towards, right? I think in India, the way I describe, people do these human chains to protest. People do morchas to protest. We love doing that, right? We learned it. I
Yeah.
think it was, as I always say, that one of the problems in India is that we never officially ended the non-cooperation movement that Gandhi started, right? So it just seems to continue. Right now, a lot of these have become emblematic, like, these human chains they make across Bombay. This symbolizes the will to act, but not knowing what to do, correct? And so I think people want to act, but they don't know how to do it.
Hmm.
And I think that articulation, I'm not saying architects and planners are the only ones, but I often speak to this, which is to pull up my professional colleagues to say that I think we have to play a much bigger role in setting the directions around which people come around and coalesce, right? That is, I mean, let's look at a city in terms of what I call the idea of nestle scales, right? So at the smallest scale, you have a building, which is a house or a piece of architecture. And then many of those sit and you get a street, that's the next scale. And then many of those collect and you get a neighborhood, and neighborhoods collect to get a district, and districts collect to make a city, and city parts collect to make a metropolitan area. Mumbai is basically a distortion of Bombay in the regional languages. Now they've invented a goddess, Mumbai, who settled in Bombay before the British. So God knows.
Okay, so Mumbai was not even like this Marathi name for Bombay.
So
Okay,
Bombay,
okay,
Bombay, Bombay was Bombay, which is the Portuguese word for good bay.
okay.
That's all. It was a good bay where the ships could land. Correct.
Just like
So
baked beans,
that's
Bangalore.
correct. Yeah. So Bombay, the British, Bombay, which is Baih, Bombay, became Bombay in English. In Hindi, it became Bombay. In Marathi, it became Mumbai. So that word just got distorted in that way. There's no kind of, I mean, this Mumba Devi, she was the goddess of the island, but there was no goddess, there was no one on the island, basically. Yeah, well, because what Indira Gandhi did is she imposed the emergency, which means she took off everybody's rights, right? Anyone could
Hmm.
be arrested, and people were, hundreds were arrested, and the press was gagged. So it was a state of emergency. I mean, it was like becoming a dictator overnight, right? And so I think two things happened. One, I think as a reaction to it, there were lots of movements that happened. Morarji Desai came out of it, Jayaprakash Narayan. I don't know if these are leaders who organized alternative parties. That was all the origins of the BJP as we see it now.
Hmm.
And many groups sort of organized, and also what became very evident in our economy and all of that was the poverty that existed in India, the shortage of housing, all that brave new world and optimism that my parents and your grandparents' generation embarked on was a myth that was broken. The tyranny
Okay.
of images is devastating, right? And when I say tyranny of images, it's like Mumbai wanted to be like Singapore, right? All our politicians say make Mumbai like Singapore or Chennai like
Right.
Singapore, right? Then the nearest town near Bombay, Nasik, wants to be like Bombay, so by default a small version of Singapore. Then the village near Nasik wants to be like, so that is the tyranny of images. So
Okay.
when our IT guys want to make a campus, they look at something in California and they want to make that campus. But I think we have to find the equivalence for our culture, because however high tech that campus, and I've done a really large software thing for HP in Bangalore, and we use some of these principles there too.
Hi, Rahul. How are you?
Good. I'm sorry. Today was my last class, so I had students
Oh, that's
lingering.
okay.
Yes.
Can I call? Would you prefer Rahul or Professor Mehrotra?
Rahul.
Thank you, thank you, Rahul. I appreciate it. I don't think I have. I'll have to get used to it. Given your credentials and
No.
your body of work, it's always hard. I mean, with pretty much every conversation that I have with the distinguished people that I do, it's like most people want to be referred to as by their first names, and it's like, okay, let me try to be natural with it. And by the way, I just started off the recording. Like I mentioned, this will not see the internet if you don't want me to put it out on the internet. Only after you bless the final product, it will go out. So I just want to give you that security and safety that,
yeah.
I'm sure you've been in situations where you said something less than perfect or something. Maybe not.
Yeah. Worse than perfect, not less than perfect.
Okay. You better tell me what that anecdote is at some point. I'd be interested in
No.
knowing.
I don't know. Just sometimes you're doing these interviews and you say stuff. Well, no, I don't think politically incorrect is the right word, but you say stuff that's not for consumption for the public, because it could be easily misinterpreted. Because sometimes you say something in the context of a conversation which means something, but then is susceptible to complete misinterpretation outside that context, right? So that's what I meant. But anyway, you've scared me by saying this is a completely organic conversation. So I'm happy to do that. I enjoy that.
Yeah.
I hope it's helpful for you. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I've spent the last, I don't know, close to a month on and off preparing for this conversation, poring over all your YouTube videos, sampling some of your written work and things like that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm fascinated, right? Like I mean, by your work, it's like, I guess let me back up here. One of the reasons why I found you and wanted to chat with you was sort of completely like almost orthogonal to what I intend to talk to you about today. It was like, changing the name of Bombay to Mumbai. I always wondered, I mean, we're in this frenzy of renaming cities and towns in India now, right? And it's like, what, I mean, there, folks are doing it at the administrative level. Are we getting enough, like buy-in from the stakeholder? Did we even, first of all, narrow down the stakeholders? Did we understand, all the soft impacts of this stuff? Of course, forget all the other hard impacts. I was doing a podcast with Kalpana Sharma, who's an independent journalist from Mumbai.
I know very well, yeah.
Oh, do you do? Okay. And I was demonstrating to her, I wrote this quick AI program to kind of go out and give me a sense of how much, money-wise this costs a city. And it came up with some very conservative number, like 172 crores was the cost to the taxpayer, because you had to go change the names in the boards. And I don't even think 172 times 10 would be kind of appropriate to me,
Yeah. But I mean, it's like, would Johnny Walker whiskey change its name after building a brand for 2 generations? No, right? I mean, I think cities are also brands. I mean, Bombay meant something, and it resonated internationally. It resonated with a culture. It resonated a history. And so I think the cost that doesn't get calculated is, I mean, I'm not a business type guy, but I think here the only word I can find is branding, and branding has value because branding has recognition. It has reliability. It has a whole lot of stuff that goes with it.
Right.
And those costs don't come. I mean, AI would be more objective and talk about the cost of signboards and street boards and and what's very interesting is airlines. When you get your baggage tag, it yet is BOM. It yet is PEK for Peking instead of Beijing. It's funny, airlines. So they, I don't know why they haven't changed the abbreviations. It's interesting.
It is interesting. It's just 3 alphabets. Why not change that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So is it some complex program that recognizes it? I don't know. But it always strikes me when I land in Bombay and I see BOM and FRK for whatever, FNT, Frankfurt or whatever it is, and then BOM. And when I went to China, the same thing. I said, PK, why not BJ? And they haven't.
Yeah, I like you talk about the brand. I never thought about that. That's such a, I mean, it's like, duh, like that's a fascinating concept. Like, when you have like like brands of perfume, New York, Los Angeles and London and Paris. Like those are the names kind of printed out on these.
Bombay gin.
Right. And they hold so much value, right? Like that kind of, like, talk about brand value. Like when I look at, you're associated with like New York, maybe you were born in New York, maybe that's one of your hubs or whatever it is. I mean, you look at Apple, they're like made in California, right? Like that's the branding they do, because California is known sort of for that.
But Rajiv, that would happen to you and me if we changed our names, right? Some people do in life change their names, and it's completely, it must be psychologically damning,
I would imagine so, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, it's intuitively obvious to me. Yeah. Like somebody said Bengaluru to me. I was in India last year, and she was this person I was talking to describing, I'm going to go back to Bengaluru, blah blah blah, and I just kind of like pulled back for a second. It's like, oh really? That's kind of become normalized now. Bangalore used to be that kind of a brand. It held some kind of a meaning to all of us, intrinsically. And then here we are, Bengaluru, and it's like, if you look at the origin of that word, the etymology, like it's just something silly, Bendakaluru, which is like the city of baked beans.
Yeah. Crazy. Even Mumbai, there was no, so Bombay in Hindi, in many local languages, as you know, in Bollywood, they said from Bombaya. Bombay. Right. So instead of saying Bombay, they said Bombay. I mean, that was the way it just translated naturally. Right. And that distortion they made into Mumbai. Now, there's a small temple of Mumbai Devi. Now, that Mumbai also must have come from Bombay Devi, must have been Bombay Devi, and so it's this. I think this is populism. I mean, this clearly happened when our right-wing politics began to settle in. Also, I mean, the way I've kind of argued about this to do with architecture too, is look, when India got independence, and in the profession of architecture, and I've written about this, we were all obsessed with creating a pan-Indian identity, rightly so, in our politics and everything, because we were a nation state that had been formed. No, we were positioned against Pakistan, etc. So the nation building agenda and the construction of a pan-Indian identity was society's occupation. Architects were involved with that. I mean, they wrote about an architecture for India. But by the 1980s, two things happened. We began to start talking about liberalization of our economy. Finally, it happened in 92. But from the so essentially what happens, this is my reading, 1947, independence. The first 15 years, optimism, building a brave new world, Nehru, his vision, his charisma, the idea of a pan-Indian identity, naturally new nation state. 1974, emergency, and the emergency is a very important watershed in that, or threshold to our history, in that it was a wake-up call for the nation. It was a wake-up call that we were yet a nation badly divided by caste, ethnic divisions, and acute poverty. It's the period of the 70s that the NGO sector, which is civil society, grows, correct? And then in 1982, but till then, the pan-Indian identity as a project is yet there. Everyone's trying. 1990, 92 precisely, we announced liberalization and neoliberalism and opening up our economy. And a reaction to that, which is the embracing of globalization, is regionalism. And regional identities, regional politics, we break into coalition politics. Congress party begins to break their regional politics. You have all those prime ministers who come for a year or two, just out of a coalition, people decide on them. We begin to reassert our regional identities, correct? That's our politics. And politics is a good indicator. And out of that assertion of regional identity comes this imaginary construction of some lost kingdom that everyone wants to regain, that erases a colonial memory. But actually, more than trying to erase colonial memory, which is what I think is the guise that's used, it's more about trying to assert a regional identity, and therefore to use localized words in some ways, in some mad way, to construct some new formulation, like Mumbai. Mumbai is basically a distortion of Bombay in the regional languages. Now they've invented a goddess, Mumbai, who settled in Bombay before the British. So God knows.
Okay, so Mumbai was not even like this Marathi name for Bombay.
So
Okay, okay,
Bombay was Bombay, which is the Portuguese word for good bay.
okay.
That's all. It was a good bay where the ships could land.
Just
Correct?
like baked
So
beans,
that's
Bangalore.
correct. Yeah. So Bombay, the British, Bombay, which is Baih, Bombay, became Bombay in English. In Hindi, it became Bombay. In Marathi, it became Mumbai. So that word just got distorted in that way. There's no kind of, this Mumba Devi, she was the goddess of the island, but there was no goddess, there was no one on the island, basically. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating to me that these things happen. And I mean, the only sort of logical takeaway that I have, in a sense, is that, or maybe we the people were asleep at the wheel. We just don't participate enough in our politics, or maybe in our communities, or something like that. And we don't have enough advocacy. We're just kind of busy, putting our head down and working. And then meanwhile, folks come in and change things left and right. And you really don't have a say. The state has monopoly over violence, monopoly over a whole lot of other things.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. I don't even know if I can find it. Many years ago, you were talking about Bangalore. So, are you from Bangalore?
Yes, I'm from Bangalore.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
then I did a piece. I did a piece about 10 or 15 years ago for the Harvard Design magazine. If I find a PDF, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
I called it "Dysfunctional Boomtown," and that was the essay. But before that, 30 years ago, I almost settled in Bangalore. I even put money down on an apartment, but various life events led me to stay in Bombay. And so I was sort of looking at Bangalore very carefully. And then I began to see the kind of, let me say, physical deterioration of the city as people began to go. And I'd written a piece in a magazine then called Indian Architect and Builder, which is to your point, where I think I'd called it "A City is Not Found." Because, I used to get really upset when I would meet people in Bombay who were either rich or retiring, and they would say, "We found a lovely place to go and settle down." And I would say, "Where?" They would say, "Bangalore." And I said, "What do you mean by found a place?" Because cities are made, they're not found, which is to your point of advocacy. We've become so passive as citizens that we find things, we don't want to make things, right? And so we don't want to participate in the making of things. And for me, there's a kind of passivity when people tell me, "Oh, I found a nice place to live, Bangalore." It's not like, I think I'm going to go and make Bangalore my home. That making is it's a process of participation. And I think what you've said about the name and advocacy and we are asleep on the wheel is absolutely true. We take for granted this happening. We think the state will provide us the infrastructure, but in today's world, we have to be making our homes, not finding them.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about Bangalore. Do you have, I think this ties into maybe a question I was going to ask you at some point. Are there maybe I'm reaching too far here, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. You have to be able to kind of build this kind of cohesive society that kind of coheres at various intervals to come together and participate in designing your neighborhood and so on. I did a podcast with this gentleman, Christian Pog. He's the Oslo Triennale director. I'm sure you've heard of him. He talked about mission neighborhoods. And one of the central point of that book, that PDF, was, you have to be able to engineer and design these towns and cities and city squares and so on, such that people come together. And anyway, so your thoughts on that, and how could we kind of massage that into the Indian context, or can we?
Yeah, we can. And I think architects have a bigger role to play than they have played, because architects are trained to create spatial imaginations. And that spatial imagination, let me say, just a picture of something. An image is very compelling for people to work towards, right? I think in India, the way I describe, people do these human chains to protest. People do morchas to protest. We love doing that, right? We learned it. I think it was, as I always say, that one of the problems in India is that we never officially ended the non-cooperation movement that Gandhi started, right? So it just seems to continue. Right now, a lot of these have become emblematic, like, these human chains they make across Bombay. This symbolizes the will to act, but not knowing what to do, correct? And so I think people want to act, but they don't know how to do it.
Mhm.
And I think that articulation, I'm not saying architects and planners are the only ones, but I often speak to this, which is to pull up my professional colleagues to say that I think we have to play a much bigger role in setting the directions around which people come around and coalesce, right? That is, let's look at a city in terms of what I call the idea of nestle scales, right? So at the smallest scale, you have a building, which is a house or a piece of architecture. And then many of those sit and you get a street, that's the next scale. And then many of those collect and you get a neighborhood, and neighborhoods collect to get a district, and districts collect to make a city, and city parts collect to make a metropolitan area, correct? And so I think the different forms of organization at all those levels, we tend to focus either at the absolutely big level or at the absolutely smallest level, which is organize our street to collect garbage, for example, right? So I think and the thing is that at every scale, there are different things that are important, and at every scale, there are different modes of communication. So at the highest regional metropolitan scale, it's all policy documents. It's that kind of thing. At the scale of the house, people will show you a rendering or a walk through your house, right? And you enjoy it. But in all those in-between scales, we don't know how to act, and how do you organize people at those scales? We haven't done enough of that. Many cities do it very successfully, especially in North Europe, which are, of course, less complex and smaller cities. But I think we in India, I'm talking to our profession, my profession, which is architects, urban designers, I think we need to do more to engage as a contribution. Society invests in doctors to keep society in better health. Society invests in architects and urban designers to imagine better spatial possibilities and ways we can make those spaces, right? We haven't taken that mission too seriously. We stick to the architecture, we wear blinkers, we look at the site, somebody tells us you have 3 FSI, leave 10 feet here, leave 10 feet there, you build. You don't care what's even on either side of you. And so we don't think in those scalar terms, unfortunately.
Do you engage in any kind of advocacy where we can actually build those up so we can have?
Yeah, I have been. And so my work in some of which is off the radar because I do it through institutions. So there's an institute called the Urban Design Research Institute in Mumbai. I used to direct it for 10 years before I started teaching. And a lot of the work we did there, I think, among many things, we brought in the first legislation for urban conservation in India, which was to protect the Fort District. Then we started we started establishing what I call contemporary engines to drive that growth. So I don't know if you've heard of the Ghoda festival. That was set up as a way to generate money to conserve that area. And then one landed up actually creating and registering with the Charity Commissioner Association. So what I did was I took the historic fort area with many of my colleagues involved, of course, and we gave it personality. So we broke the historic fort area into 10 districts. We called one the art district, we called one a banking district, we called one a shopping spine, a tourist district, etc. And then we met prominent citizens in those areas and got them to register in an association, got it registered to the Charity Commissioner so people could give you money. And then they all instituted different forms of improvement through these associations. So that was like the middle scale because it was large neighborhoods that were doing this. And that, I think, became a model for other things that happened in Bombay. So that was one end. And the other end of the spectrum, we were looking at things like, we did the first report on looking at Bombay's port lands and how that land could be recycled. It hasn't yet happened, for it's very contested. The mill areas, the textile mill areas, we were the ones who triggered off setting up the Charles Courier Commission to write the report. But again, between the politicians and the mill owners, they bought all that land. So the point is, one has, of course, tried, often failed. And there are many people doing it. I'm not the only one. But I mean, I think I can say unabashedly that when I was doing this in the 90s, there weren't many other precedents of this. Yeah, although we did it largely for heritage conservation, but we also did it to preserve open spaces and a number of things like that. And I think Bombay, I mean, just for whatever it's worth, because you're telling me about Bangalore has triggered off many thoughts. I mean, I think one of the things about Bombay is it has had a long tradition of the participation of civil society.
Okay.
And by civil society, trade unions are civil society, right? We've had the strongest trade unions in Mumbai because of the mills and, the industry and that legacy, etc. I think civil society to me is that part of society that has the empathy for the grassroots, but it has the wherewithal, the training, the education to negotiate with more powerful forces, right? So in Mumbai, NGOs that try to help slum dwellers not get evicted, have the ability to actually negotiate with the Maharashtra government or the World Bank if they're trying to displace people for a water supply project or whatever. So I think civil society around the world, including the United States, is something that we need to take seriously. I tell my students here that they shouldn't wait for government commissions. They shouldn't wait for private commissions. They should align with civil society and organize commissions, right, which are good for the city and they'll pay, etc. And so I think civil society and civil society, I think we will take more seriously around the world because it allows this combination of empathy as well as the ambition to be able to negotiate. And I think that's a critical component if one has to organize citizens in the way you're asking me. And I think Mumbai has had a culture of doing that. Maybe in Bangalore, it'll develop slowly. I think Calcutta had a bit of that culture. This has to do with legacies of colonial institutions like the universities, which spawned a particular kind of intellectual culture that also was activist in nature, etc. And so, I mean, I haven't studied this adequately, but that's just my hunch.
Yeah, you talk about civil societies, like would HOAs, homeowner associations, qualify as?
Oh, totally.
Okay. Okay.
I think any group that can band together with a clear understanding of a common interest, but yet have the empathy for both ends of the spectrum, right? The more powerful forces, but also the grassroots, which is what civil society, which is what trade unions actually do. Trade unions is a classic, I think although trade unions always people treat as something else, but I think trade unions is a classic example of civil society. The rich are not comfortable with it because basically they are compromising their wealth it's a Robin Hood situation.
Right.
It's a completely Robin Hood.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like how I'm picturing it from a systems viewpoint is that these civil societies are kind of like the feedback loop to the whole machinery.
Perfect.
Right?
That's a very, very, very good description.
Yeah, but the other question that pops in my head is when I look at Bangalore, for example, my personal experience has been thus far that we've got a very stratified city. I've been to Mumbai many times. There is a more of this kind of intermingling sort of nature in Mumbai in general. You look at all the neighborhoods, but in Bangalore, I could draw a straight line across the city and kind of delineate which side is the predominantly Hindu side, and then there's a Muslim side, and there's a Christian, predominantly British colonial side, and so on. I mean, if one had to go have a good time in downtown, so to speak, it would be Brigade Road, Commercial Street, and things like that. And I never saw that kind of those lines blurring as much as Mumbai. It's kind of like this, I don't know, historical artifact, or maybe my bias as I look at it, but it's very like you can measure these things, the number of like institutions, the religious institutions and the language spoken and all of that, very germane to each part of Bangalore.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, Rajiv, I don't know Bangalore as well as you probably know it, but I think what I'd say in response to your observation is that Actually, every city has those definitions.
Sure.
But in some cases, so with greater density, that commingling actually increases just by default, right? But one can actually draw the similar lines in Mumbai.
Yeah.
You tell me where you live in Mumbai, I'll give you your background, right? And you tell
It's
me.
so but don't you agree that it's such an underappreciated phenomenon about Indian life that you have? I mean, maybe it's universally too, but I don't know. I mean, it's hard to compare to the West, in my opinion, but it's kind of underappreciated that you go to all these cities, there are very like, bubbles that you could find, which you could clearly put a label on it and say, this is this group of people and
down
their
to
businesses.
The buildings, sometimes down to the buildings, yeah.
Right.
In Bombay, because they're high-rise buildings. In Bangalore, of course. But of course, different areas you can, totally. You can.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'd like to ask you a question, Rahul, if you're okay with it. Like, what you talk about this kind of, architects playing a larger role and things like that. I don't know if you're in the minority or the majority. You clearly have a philosophical sort of underpinning to your thought and the way you speak and advocate and so forth. How did that develop?
I studied architecture in Ahmedabad. It was a classic architecture training. And then I came here and I studied urban design at Harvard. And then after that, I worked for a year. And I think those two were very seminal in ways that one is working now. And let me try to tell you how. I think you used the word feedback loop, which was very insightful when you talked about civil society. I see urban design as a practice in the same way. I don't call urban design a discipline. I think it's a practice. Urban designers, and I studied it here, are architects who are exposed to planning practice and become familiar with the language of planning, and I call it a bridge practice, which is a practice that understands the site specificity of architecture. As I was saying, it's very blinkered, and the abstraction of planning, which is abstract land use plan, colors, blobs on a plan, some policy documents. Yeah. And what we as urban designers do is we read planning policy and we anticipate what the built impacts of those policies will be, right? So some guy sitting in government in a planning department suddenly increases the FSI or FAR in some area by 1. It seems innocuous, no one worries about it, but that can mean the buildings would go from 8 stories to 16 stories, which means the density would double, which means there'll be no water supply, the cars will jam, etc. No one anticipates that. So urban designers do that. But what I understood in my training from urban design is it was about these feedback loops. It was about me playing a role where if I understood planning policy, I had it it was contingent on me and morally contingent on me to highlight the implications of this, right? So these feedback loops that you were talking about and making a bridge between these two. So I was it was mind-blowingly expansive when I came and studied that. And then I only worked for a year, but in that year, I worked for an African-American architect who was doing community organizing. And I would go with him in the evenings with boards of drawings to neighborhoods in really rundown neighborhoods in Roxbury and places in Boston. And we would be presenting to the neighborhood, the plans that he was making for them. That gave me a lot of confidence to communicate, and it made me understand how constituency building was very important, which is to say, politicians have constituencies. As architects, we wait for a client to knock on our door. And so when I went back to Mumbai, I did a lot of that. And that's how that historic district, I organized associations, because I felt I had to create those constituencies who would drive this process, And I think that's what really led me to all of this. And what happened, again, I can reflect on it and see it clearly, is that in Mumbai, my reputation started building as someone who's interested in history and conservation in the old buildings. That was how people chose to imagine me. I never got work in Mumbai. I did some interior projects and things. And all my work was largely in the South, actually. I don't know, someone called me to do a house. I did a house in the South. Everything works by word of mouth. And so, before I knew it, 90% of my work is between Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai, and little bits here and there in Kunur and Coimbatore, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad. Yeah, that's where 90% of my work is. And my activism and my writing and my work on committees and with the government and all of that is in Mumbai. And now I'm less and less doing that, just because one is older and has less energy, but also because I'm spending time teaching. And my mission now is to empower another generation to go out and do that kind of thing.
Oh, wow, cool. I mean, do you have, like, I was going to say, do you have like partners in this, contemporaries in this, who are doing similar sort of thing in India specifically?
Well, yes. I mean, there are people. I don't know how many people are combining these things in the way I'm doing, which is a full practice now, teaching and doing this advocacy. But there are a lot of work. There are a lot of NGOs. I mean, India, like I said, after if you made a list of 20 NGOs that you think have done significant work on public health, on housing, on whatever in India, they all emanated post-emergency, where I think India woke up to think that the civil society has to play a role. The government, the state, we recognize the failure of the state. And I think from that also came the regionalism, because then state governments felt like, why am I being pulled down by UP if I'm in Telangana? I might as well just get my act together. Or, your Ramakrishna Hegde in Bangalore at that time, if you remember, you might be too young for that.
No, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, he just sort of changed the way a chief minister operates in terms of efficiency, and ran into other problems. But you suddenly began to have these very localized stars that came up and began to come out of Nehru and Indira Gandhi's shadow. Yeah.
What I'm very poorly read on the emergency. So could you describe to me what was that wake-up call? What made people more aware of their duties as civil, society?
Yeah, well, because what Indira Gandhi did is she imposed the emergency, which means she took off everybody's rights, right? Anyone could be arrested, and hundreds were arrested, and the press was gagged. So it was a state of emergency. I mean, it was like becoming a dictator overnight, right? And so I think two things happened. One, I think as a reaction to it, there were lots of movements that happened. Morarji Desai came out of it, Jayaprakash Narayan. I don't know if these are leaders who organized alternative parties. That was all the origins of the BJP as we see it now. Many groups sort of organized. And also what became very evident in our economy and all of that was the poverty that existed in India, the shortage of housing, all that brave new world and optimism that, my parents and your grandparents' generation embarked on was a myth that was broken. It was very important to gain independence. It was very important to propel us. Many good things happened from that in terms of institutions like the IITs and all that were built. But clearly it was unequal development. It's not different from what is happening in politics here, where suddenly you realize the East and West have benefited in a different way from Middle America, which base has gone with industry, right? It's the same kind of thing. It's a wake-up call. You'll see that will happen in America. Politics are going to change so much that both political parties will have to engage with the middle, right? I mean, the Republicans might yet lie their way out of it, but the Democrats will have to, and you can already see that reorientation in higher education institutions. I mean, that discussion is already happening because there are lots of federal grants, federal support. There'll be taxes imposed on endowments, etc., as a way to balance and give to other schools potentially, correct? Again, so I think this recalibration is very important, and I think the emergency forced us to recalibrate. And it was then Narasimha Rao who, a decade later, realized that the only solution out of this would be to privatize, which means to let private sector, like the rest of the world was doing globally. Whether that was the right decision or not, I don't know. But then it was Manmohan Singh, who had been a World Bank economist, that could translate that open economy, right? He did it. These guys presently are screwing it up, but they don't understand it in the way Manmohan Singh did. He understood it and played the game at the global level with all the global players, correct? And so that was a direction India decided to take. Now, I'm not saying I have my opinion on whether that was a good thing or not, and I don't think it was, because it's created even more inequity.
Yeah.
But that's what happened. And so the emergency, I mean, let me say this, the emergency was merely emblematic of that moment of the shift.
Okay. The other thing that you mentioned too was quite striking to me, is that you said for the first time during the emergency, we came to terms with India's like kind of lack of development as it was perceived at that time. And people expected like a brave new India. People thought we were on this amazing path of growth and glory and so on. It seems to me we're rhyming in that sense too, right? Like history rhymes in a certain sense. Like we talk about a $5 trillion economy at a GDP level, and then at a per capita GDP, we're in the bottom, less than the bottom third now at the moment, and which is quite underappreciated. But you know, anyway, I don't want to get too political in this conversation. One question I wanted to ask you, Rahul, was Copenhagen, I mean, Denmark. You know, I was reading this today on Reddit, and I saw that India ranked in the bottom third in the happiness index. And I was going through the comment section and things like that, the usual suspects of the subreddits that I'm on. And the reaction on some groups, which are heavily right-leaning, let's say, was that, well, you know, it's the Danes don't understand what happiness is. This is a very kind of abstract concept, and you know, and these are up to interpretations. They don't get it. Blah blah blah. Meanwhile, when I look up what the things that lead into the happiness index is, things like longevity, you know, GDP, having money, living longer. These are all like common sense things. Now, you know, I want to put that on one side, and then you've got Melbourne that wins, you know, most livable city in the world year after year, and so on. And I'm sure you have critiques on that too. But these to me sound like, you know, like you look at a picture of Denmark or videos of Denmark, if you've been there, or Melbourne and things like that, like you generally feel good when you go to these places. There is this sense of harmony. There's the sense of organization, people sort of coalescing much more. There's less tension and so on. Can you speak to a little bit of that? Like this, like, you know, in the European context, you have that. In the Australian context, you have that. Like, is there ways, like low-hanging fruit at the moment, that we could do something like that in Bombay, in Bangalore, in Delhi, and so on? It seems like the divisions, the fractures have even more sort of like amplified in the last few years, in my opinion.
Oh, no. Gosh, totally. Very depressing. And my short answer is no.
Oh, come on. we try to be optimistic on and less cynical on the Idea Sandbox.
No, look, I mean, let's just take pollution here. I mean, you grew up in Bangalore. Till what year were you growing up in Bangalore?
2001. Before you answer that, I think I'll be on board with you on everything that you're about to say, Rahul. Like, okay, so we know the numbers, the AQI, and all of that stuff. If you were at the wheel, if you had all the power in the world, what kind of imagination would you paint for India? Like, you're talking about architects have this duty to, you know, spatial imagination and so on. Like, what are some of the low-hanging fruits things we could do? I mean, I look at, like, you know, I was in Chennai for a year and a half back in 2012. I look at a railway station was built near my house in Indiranagar, which is kind of a decently, middle class, upper middle class neighborhood. I mean, this structure was so bad. It was just overbuilt, you know, just super high ceilings, which was not required, in my opinion. There were a lot of open spaces.
On whole floor to the...
Yeah. That, and then on top of that, there's all these air rooms. So they had to spend a shitload of money, I imagine, to build those domes and so on. But then there's all these kind of like neglected, you know, derelict rooms in it. And I'm sure they spent an arm and a leg on these things. Oh my God. Like, you know, these are like shocking things. So it's just like, if you're at the wheel, if Rahul was the guy who could, like, you know, like how Trump is assembling, not that I endorse any of this, he's assembling a team of people who have had real world experience in certain things, let's say. You might agree, might not agree with that, but some people have good experience. What would you do? What are some of the quick things you would orchestrate?
Oh, gosh. You know, well, first of all, Well, okay, let me go back to what I was going to ask you. Well, you grew up in 2000, so you're much, much younger than me. But, when I was growing up, I'm probably 15 or 20 years older than you. But when I was growing up, we took air and water for granted, right?
Yes.
You can't any longer, correct? So I think
Yes.
that's quality of life. I mean, one of the things I enjoy coming back to Boston from Mumbai is going to my kitchen, opening the tap after I've gotten from the airport and having a glass of water, right? I don't have to go to my aqua guard and boil the water and all this kind of stuff, or resort to Bisleri or Himalaya or, something like that, correct? So I think those are also linked to quality of life. Now, I think when you say low-hanging fruit, I don't think there are any low-hanging fruits
Okay.
because we've got ourselves into a very complex problem, right? So I think there are two levels at which one can address it. Now, I'm being king for a day, right?
Sure.
You've told me, right? So I think what we would have to do is to simultaneously work at two scales, at two temporal scales, but also at two physical scales, right? So I think at the short term, at both the temporal as well as the physical, I think what we would have to do is to get the basic fundamentals of life right, which is air, which is water. And when I say this is, it's not low-hanging fruit. It's a lot of effort, right?
Yeah.
It means getting cars off like we did in COVID for weeks to fix things and fixing water systems, etc. Because I think if we solve those two, 90% of our public health problems will go away because they're all linked to that, correct? I mean, housing and all is much more complex. So for housing and things, and I say we go to the next scale, which is the dictum I use is the solutions for Dharavi don't lie in Dharavi. Mr. Adani is trying to fix Dharavi. I don't think that can happen. The solutions of Dharavi lie in imagining the metropolitan region of Mumbai and thinking about housing in a more holistical term. Now, what my new research is in a book which I hope will be out in 6 months. It's called Becoming Urban, and it's looking at India's urban trajectory. And there what we are doing is what I'm arguing really is that our big cities, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Calcutta, Bombay, Delhi, Chandigarh, you can name about 30 of them, are black holes, which means they're sucking up not only all our intellectual capital, but also our monetary capital. That's why they're making flying over what? I have no idea. They're just making flyovers. There's a pot of money, and it's these 25, 30, 40 cities that have the capacity where there are engineers and planners who can write proposals to the central government. They get a bunch of money, they fly over something else, right? We're building what my friend Arjun Apudarai calls the weapons of mass construction, right? They're devastating Indian cities like the station that you just sort of described, right? And so, what my research is showing is actually, Rajiv, if you and I took 5 minutes and tried to name towns in India, cities and towns in India, I don't think we would collectively go beyond 50 or 60 at the most, correct? Now, there's something like 2,500 places that are deemed towns in India, correct? And my research is showing that there are over 15,000 other places that should be towns, but they're yet qualified as villages. Because India has a very, very outdated criteria for what qualifies as a town. There are 3 criteria. Bear with me, this is important.
Sure.
One criteria is the settlement must have 5,000 people. The second criteria is it must have a density of 400 people per square kilometer. And the third bizarre criteria is 75% of the male population should be engaged in non-agricultural employment, right? Now, let me just take each one of these and tell you. 5,000 people, yeah, that's pretty big. Most of those lovely Italian towns we like to go holiday in don't have more than 500-600 people. 5,000 is a lot, right? 400 people per square kilometer. Greater Houston is 240 people per square kilometer. 400 people per square kilometer is a very high density. And 75% of the male population in agriculture, that doesn't exist. Every guy who's your driver in Bangalore goes back to his village to have his farming, right? So it's both, correct? And they do both. So these criteria are giving us a reading of urban India, which is completely
skewed view.
Completely skewed. And so there are, Rajiv, there are places that are 150,000 people that are yet villages run by a panchayat because they don't meet these criteria. So they don't have public health, they don't have municipalities, they don't have any money for infrastructure.
Wait, so if they're not classified as a town, they don't get those things allocated at all, budgetarily speaking?
No. They have to fight
Wow.
for it. They have a panchayat that runs it, 5 elders.
And so if whatever they need in those terms, like, health and blah blah blah, they have to go to the nearest town. Like,
You have
what
to go-
is
exactly. That's why when you go to a Bombay hospital, you go to Tata Cancer Center in Bombay, there are people sleeping on the sidewalk because they've come from villages for cancer treatment, but they can't get a bed.
Oh, it's a systemic
Oh,
problem.
it's hugely systemic. So, I mean,
Right.
my point was only this,
Duh.
that we have to
Sorry.
take our gaze away from.
I was about to add to that, Rahul. I wanted you to finish the point. I was like, oh man, I wanted to finish my point, is that it's a systemic problem. Duh, yes, but it's also, to me, it sounds like a low-hanging fruit. You fix that threshold.
Yeah, but yeah. So for example, let me just tell you what happens. So if I take each criteria, my reading of urban India is completely different. So if I take the criteria of 400 people per square kilometers of density, I have the world's mega city that goes from Kashmir to Calcutta and is 300 miles wide, which is the Indo-Gangetic Plain. It's complete. And if I take Kerala, that's equally high density, correct? But if I use the criteria of 75% in agriculture, that megacity disappears completely because everyone in the Indo-Gangetic Plain is doing both things. So the government's investments are going into places where the investment doesn't need to go. And that's why you see these ugly things in Chennai and flyover after flyover in Mumbai and, madness.
What are the ugly things in Chennai you're referring to? I talk about the railway station.
No, I'm talking about the metro, how it just devastates the whole city as a thing. We build bigger and bigger and bigger and less efficient airports, for example. I mean, our airports get high tech, but that's CISF guy checking your passport at the entrance is doing it so slowly, like he's reading the Bhagavad Gita, that the line is like you stand in a 1 mile long line to get into the bloody high-tech airport. Yeah. So, it's highly dysfunctional, the whole system.
Yeah. Okay. So, it sounds like.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead, Rahul. I wasn't making any interesting
So
points.
if I didn't put all my investment in the Chennai airport and I built 30 other airports in the smaller towns, which then from villages become real towns, then all those people don't come to Chennai to fly out to Singapore. Yeah.
Right. Moving on to another quick topic. This is a curiosity of mine. You talk about these, what you call these kind of transitory spaces, these soft thresholds, right? And I was thinking, man, like, I wonder what kind of pushback you get, because I'm thinking if somebody's building an IT park, they want it to be sort of an elite facility. They want it to be exclusive and not let people from a certain class of society to enter their spaces and so on. I wonder if that's how that goes down. So when you're negotiating these designs with these clients, you're saying, hey, we need to have a garden misting system around the C-suite, office or something like that. What kind of pushback do you get, or did you get pushback?
No, I haven't got pushback. I think, and that's what we started our conversation with. I think it's contingent upon us as professionals to show people those possibilities, right? I think people don't know better. The tyranny of images is devastating, right? And, when I say tyranny of images, it's like, Mumbai wanted to be like Singapore, right? All our politicians say, make Mumbai like Singapore or Chennai like Singapore, right? Then the nearest town near Bombay, Nasik, wants to be like Bombay. So by default, a small version of Singapore. Then the village near Nasik wants to be like, so that is the tyranny of images. So when our IT guys want to make a campus, they look at something in California and they want to make that campus. But I think we have to find the equivalence for our culture, because however high-tech that campus, and I've done a really large software thing for HP in Bangalore, and we use some of these principles there too. And once they understood the benefits of what they were getting, so I'll tell you what we did. And I mean, I could, I'm not prepared now. I could show you slides, but essentially, I'll tell you what we did.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted 5 blocks, which would have been glass-clad, separate blocks with floors, etc. Now they need it for privacy. They need it for various things. We came up with a solution where we did a 3-floor high street, and we attached blocks to it. So everyone had to come to the street, so there was social interaction. Otherwise, in each block, people would have never met people in the other block. And we also, between the blocks, made provisions for bridges. So if they wanted to combine 2 blocks for a client, they could do it. In the process, we also minimized the air condition, cut it down by less than half, because we didn't need to air condition the circulation areas, which they would otherwise do in the block. So they saved a lot on air conditioning. Of course, they resisted it initially, but when we could explain to them these benefits as metrics they would understand, they accepted it. And it turned out to be, I would say, a very seriously efficient building. It was for Hewlett Packard. So they wanted LEED certificates, and the LEED guys looked at us and said, no, you're not air conditioning everything. How can we give you a LEED certificate? And it was bizarre. So it brought to the front all these hegemonies that exist, Western hegemonies, which lead to green industries. So what we proved to them was that according to the LEED requirement, normally business as usual, you do 240. Business as usual, you do 200 square feet per ton of air conditioning, correct? Now, to get a LEED certificate, you have to take it up to about 250 square feet of air conditioning on 1 ton, which means you make efficient air conditioning, you seal your windows. We did 650 square feet per ton. But we did that not by making the system efficient, but we did that by air conditioning only half the spaces, right? Okay. That's like a low-tech solution, correct? Because we made the other spaces ventilate. In Bangalore. You call it the air-conditioned city. I said, you got an air-conditioned city, what are you doing air conditioning for?
Right.
So it's a matter of changing mindsets. And I don't believe, yes, we've got pushback. People, you might have to work harder to make your ideas be realized, but it's worth it.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that too, I was reading about those, vacation homes of these rich folks who, have, somewhere in the outskirts where it's next to a village or something. And, you have these community taps that people can come and use. And the brilliant idea, it makes intuitive sense to me that you're sort of like, I've experienced that quite. So in Bangalore, I'm sure you've heard of Nrityagram, the dance village, of course.
Pratima Bedi.
Yes. And what do you think? But let's take a quick detour. Like, what do you think about the whole architecture and that whole space that they've created?
Yeah, no, it's very organic. It was of a time. Gerard D'Cunha, who did it with Pratima Bedi, was a free spirit. And Gerard D'Cunha, it was also the time of Laurie Baker, and people were building.
Who are all these people? I have no clue, Rahul.
Okay. So, Laurie Baker was an English architect, and he did a lot of work in Kerala. You should look him up. Now, of course, he's gone. But what he did was he challenged the normal ways of production of architecture, and he partnered often with craftspeople and gave them very minimal intention plans and let them actually innovate. So the person who built Pratima Bedi's Nityagram worked in that spirit, which means he didn't do elaborate drawings and things. He got the guys who do granite and who do brick, and he said, okay, let's do something here. So, at one level, you could say it's very clumsy and looks primitive, and, it's thatch huts.
Looks amazing to me.
Yeah, correct. So, but it's refreshingly different, and it's amazing, correct? So, so these are, it's different ways of doing things. And I think, that's appropriate for a Pratima Bedi dance academy, but it might not be appropriate for a high-tech software center.
I would live in it.
No, it's not a matter of living in it, but it's also the contingencies of computer, dust-free, all of that.
Yes, right? Indeed.
So the question is, how do you make these balances, and how do you see the simultaneous validity of different ways of doing things, of different ways of making, of different materials? That pluralism is something that's going out of our lives, because I think what Western modernity gave us was universalizing absolute solutions, right? And that's what globalization perpetuated. So every city around the world is looking the same. It has nothing to do with context, nothing to do with locally available materials. Everything looks like a Dubai or a Singapore and aspires to be that, right? You can see it in all our cities. It's so stupid.
Yeah, to that point, I was thinking Santa Fe, New Mexico is kind of managed to keep that little bit in part of the town.
That's right, yeah. And many European cities have managed to do it. And
okay.
Jaipur is a good example. Jaipur has maintained a lot of that. So some cities by default, for other reasons of history,
Yeah.
have done it. But I think, unfortunately, the world is riddled with this absolutism. And that's what I meant by the tyranny of images. Images are very compelling. Like I have clients who tell me, I want this building to look like a global building, which is what they're basically telling you is make it 6 or 7 stories high and clad the bloody thing in glass to the extent you can, right? That's what they mean by global image. And so...
Wink, wink. Okay, so I found something very interesting. You said this architect who built Nityagram, he got a bunch of like artisans together, and then he said, "Go for it, go for it, and design it
within
limits, of course, constraints and stuff." Like it sounds to me like that would be something you've talked about it or written about it. I'm not sure, but using local. Yeah, using the local ingredients, locally available raw material, and so forth, and distilling the design sensibilities of that town and so on. Like, seems like it's also probably cost effective, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I wrote a book called Architecture in India since 1990, and that is a book which looks at what happens in India after the liberalization of our economy. And I broke the projects that I covered, I broke them into 4 categories. The first was, I called it global practices, which is the architecture of impatient capital, which is, I'm arguing that capital is intrinsically impatient, and the terrains that allow capital to realize its value without any friction are the landscapes of impatient capital. So Dubai is the ultimate landscape of impatient capital, Singapore, Pudong in Shanghai, etc., etc. And so when capital lands in our cities, there are huge resistances all the way from corruption to flawed building practices, etc. But anyway, that is the architecture of global capital. That's all the high-rise office buildings we see in all our cities, correct? And that comes transmitted through email from some office sitting in France or in Germany, and some local architect takes it, bribes the local guys, gets permission to build it, and it gets built, right? Then the second category I said was what I called regional practices, which are architects. I would put myself in that practice, which is, we know what modern architecture is, we know how the world builds, but we are sensitive in some ways to locality and cultural practices and things like that. The third category I put were alternate practices, where it's a completely alternate way of building. I think Nityagram isn't part of that. I've covered Laurie Baker, where the means of communication and instruction are much looser. It's more collaborative, where I get a bunch of really good masons who can do granite, and I say, look, let's have this height, this width, this is a plan, this is a division. How do you think we should fix the granite? Should it be poles? Should it be blocks? And we work together and we evolve something. Very few drawings. It's really verbal, etc. And then the fourth category I put was, I called it the resurfacing of the ancient, or counter-modernism, which is, temples like the Akshardham. There's so many temples being built in India, which look like they could have been built 5,000 years ago, but are being built now, and it's a huge amount of investment. The Vipassana Pagoda outside Bombay, Bangalore has a number of this. The Hare Krishna mission has built these. They are built as they would be built previously, and they used completely different protocols. The Akshardham temple, it was built by, there were no architects, they were engineers who were the disciples of the sect. They actually identified drought-ridden villages around India. They then made sculpture yards there where they were carving things. And then they used the Toyota just-in-time software to get the temple components in time to Delhi to be built. So it's cutting-edge technology, but very ancient images and intention, right? So I categorize what I was seeing as architecture in India in these 4 categories. And actually what I argue is none of them is better than the other. They all have their value. They all happen simultaneously. The challenge is really for urban design, where in a city, how do you make all that disparity work in some coherent form together? And what is happening in our cities is a cacophony, because everything is happening randomly and there's no coherence. You can't walk down a street in any of our cities and see coherence in terms of facades, architecture. It's suddenly a high-rise building next to a slum, next to a temple, next to something else. It's complete madness.
But what you just described, or advocating for these 4 different ways of building, like you're saying, each one has to be proportionately allocated in the city in some sense, and sort of coexist.
Yeah, no, what I'm arguing is those four categories come from my observation. It's not my
Right.
proposal. But I'm just saying if that is what is happening, we have to find a way they can coherently coexist. They
How
don't
would
need.
a coherent look? I mean, what would it look like in terms of
Yeah,
numbers and
yeah,
the
yeah,
look?
yeah, yeah. No, what it would look like is, therefore, then it comes to master planning in cities. No, for example, right now we don't even allocate places for public space. We don't allocate
Sure.
it for religious thing. Any guy under a tree can make a temple. Yeah, that's what happens. You tie one cow to it, you put some grass, you come feed the cow, and everyone's praying there, right? And it unfortunately happens to be outside your house, then you're screwed. Yeah. So correct. So we. So,
I'm going to have to think about leaving this part in the podcast.
yeah, but you know what I mean, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
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 So the point is that I think this is where urban planning is important, is what are the components of the city? Where are they placed in the plan of the city? What are the relationship between where people live and where they work and how they get there? Where are their public amenities like temples, hospitals, schools? These allocations don't exist. And so once you did that, then within those allocations, people could build in any style, but there'll be a coherence in terms of how activities, movement, etc. happen. Right now,
Okay.
that's bizarre. It's all over the place.
So you're saying like a city like Chandigarh would be a decent prototype of something like that?
Okay, so let me say this. Chandigarh got a lot of criticism as a city for the first 60 years of its life.
Did it really?
Oh, a lot. I mean, yeah, because it was seemed to be sanitized on a grid,
Oh, okay.
broad roads, no trees. I went to Chandigarh a few years ago. It's the most beautiful city in India.
Yeah.
Now the grid is filled up. There's a kind of order. There's a thing, and within that there's chaos, and that's fantastic because
Right.
that is the perfect balance between chaos and order. Right? We need Jaipur is like that. Jaipur was on a grid. Jai Singh
Okay.
actually was way ahead of its time in the 1600s.
Really?
He put it on a grid. It's 9 squares. It came from the mandala, the 9 squares, but by default it became a grid. You go to the old city of Jaipur, it's a fabulous combination of order and chaos. That's what India
Okay.
needs.
That's what India needs. On that very note, Rahul, I am so blessed to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for chatting with a dude like me in the Midwest, some random guy you just got on the phone with. I really appreciate your time, sir.
Yeah, well, but that's a perfect example of order and chaos, right?
I guess
Bye.
it is. I guess it is. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.